Half of House Democrats backing impeachment, disturbing video breaking of violence right outside Donald Trump's rally. And Congress may be on vacation, but facts, they don't take vacations. And it is reporting and facts that have just, late today, sunk Trump's latest national security pick. So we're going to get to all that, but we begin tonight with a headline that few probably expected when Bob Mueller first testified, which was just last week. If it feels like longer, then maybe you've been busy like we have. But tonight, for the first time ever, we can report a majority of House Democrats back impeachment, 118 members.
If a majority of your caucus wants to go forward with an impeachment inquiry, would you go for it?
It's not even close in our caucus.
But eventually,
well, you know what? Why are we speculating on hypotheticals?
Not even close. Hypotheticals. Those talking points just died. So while Speaker Pelosi is certainly working during this recess, visiting Ghana on a congressional trip along with other members, including one of the congresswomen that Donald Trump personally attacked, Ilhan Omar, this is pressure clearly building on her, on Speaker Pelosi, and the rest of her party's leadership for when they do return to Washington. Chairman Nadler, who voted to impeach back when 40% of the caucus was for it, asserts that essentially this is already moving in a way even without what Speaker Pelosi is saying, because he and others have said that the impeachment investigation has begun. So there's a major shift here. And while Washington is obviously always divided by party, we know that, there's also signs that I want to point out tonight that these pressures against Trump are hitting both parties. More Republicans facing the strains that come with trying to live within this party of Trump. Look at it like this. It was just under a year ago that, remember the blue wave, which evicted so many Republicans from Congress? It also added gender and racial diversity to the House. That's part of what Donald Trump's been attacking lately. And it also removed some of the Republican Party's only minority members, like Congresswoman Mia Love. She was the party's only black woman in Congress. Well, today, the news is that the only black congressman the GOP had left after that, Congressman Will Hurd, is retiring rather than running again. As Democrats count up the ranks for impeachment, the GOP is counting up these retirements. Hurd is the sixth Republican in just the last 2 weeks, and he has been blunter than most about the Trump era, saying Republicans need to learn, don't be an a-hole, don't be a racist, don't be a misogynist, right? Don't be a homophobe. These are real basic things we all should learn when we were in kindergarten. I've been reading from, yes, a sitting Republican member of Congress. If it sounds like something you're not used to hearing, well, this tells you something about Mr. Hurd. Now, is he calling out Trump specifically? Yes. He was one of only 4 Republicans who voted to condemn Donald Trump's, quote, racist attacks on those 4 House freshmen. And with Congress now on recess, that means we actually now know something. We know one of Hurd's last acts before announcing his retirement was to vote for a resolution which condemned, and I want us to remember it tonight as the context, it condemned, quote, President Trump's racist comments that have legitimized hatred of new Americans and people of color, and which stated that the U.S. House, quote, believes that immigrants and their descendants have made America stronger, and that the United States must be open to those lawfully seeking refuge and asylum from violence and oppression. Maybe Mr. Hurd knew then, as he voted for that rare rebuke of a sitting president, that he would no longer be serving in this Republican Party. It appears he'd certainly already decided all of that by just this week, when another Democrat running to replace Trump used his spotlight on the debate stage to call on Republicans in Congress to consider how what they do now could define their careers forever.
If you are watching this at home and you are a Republican member of Congress, consider the fact that when the sun sets on your career and they are writing your story of all the good and bad things you did in your life, the thing you will be remembered for is whether in this moment with this president you found the courage to stand up to him or you continue to put party over country.
Join me now, New York Times columnist Michelle Goldberg and Eleanor Clift, Washington correspondent for the Daily Beast. Eleanor, do you see all these trends running together?
I see a lot of pressure on House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. More than 50% of the Democratic caucus is not a winning number in the full House. I think she still is at a point where she wants to protect the Democratic members who are holding Republican districts that were represented by Trump Republicans very recently. So I think she's doing the right thing, and we've got now this period of time when everybody is off in their districts. And I think the pro-impeachment people are putting a lot of pressure on members who have gone home. So I think that the Judiciary Committee has Pelosi's blessing to continue as though impeachment were authorized, and they're doing everything that they were supposed to do, and they could dislodge some testimony from various figures in the Mueller investigation. So whether they finally give the go-ahead, it will be in September or October, and I think it could well happen. But I don't think there's anything wrong with keeping it as on a slow burner at this point and letting the Democratic candidates also work this out as the Democrats try to figure out who their nominee is going to be.
Michelle, take a listen to Congressman Hurd on all of this.
Mm-hmm.
I think those tweets are racist and xenophobic. Look, I'm the only black Republican in the House of Representatives. I go into communities that most Republicans don't show up in order to take a conservative message. And when you have this being the debate, that activity becomes even harder.
Michelle?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, the parties are now increasingly polarized around race, right? The reason that most African Americans are Democrats is not because African Americans are more liberal than white people necessarily, but it's because one party is a racist party. One party is headed by a president who throws racial slurs around, that is specifically devoted to purging people of color from voter rolls, that has, is kind of taking aim at the basic civic compact that this country has tried to forge with all of its citizens since the civil rights movement, right? Since we actually became a representative democracy. You have a president who is single-handedly devoted to rolling that back, to creating America as a state for only some of its citizens instead of all of them. And so, of course, people who aren't in that kind of Herrenvolk community are not going to be attracted to that project.
Yeah, and Michelle, when you say not attracted to it, right, we're speaking diplomatically. I mean, we talk a lot about ideological sorting. The country's been through racial sorting before, and it's not obviously permanent partisanship. The Democratic Party was highly associated with racism and segregationists, and LBJ shifted that, and you had this resorting. The Republican Party is here, as you just both mentioned, in a different standing, and yet what do you think, Michelle, it means to have Mia Love's departure from a blue wave, Mr. Hurd's departure here, and be left with an actual representative body? I mean, this is their entire national House caucus, and will become literally all white.
Right. And plus they have, one African American in the Senate, none in governorships. It is overwhelmingly the party of white men. And I think before Trump, you had a party that recognized that as a problem. I mean, I remember reading Ralph Reed, the head of the Christian Coalition's book, about how the Christian right needed to repent for the sin of racism, right? Repent for being on the wrong side of the civil rights movement in many cases. You saw, Reince Priebus's famous autopsy, where he talked about the party needed to conduct some sort of outreach to communities of color. And then Trump came along and showed that you could win with a straight up xenophobic nationalist appeal. And the party really gave up on that. But it's still not clear that just because Trump did this once with this extremely flukish victory in the Electoral College, that just kind of pure racism is a recipe for long-term success.
Yeah, and that's such an important point you raise, because flukish is one way to put it. Another, more mathematically, is he got fewer votes, not more votes than the other person. So
right,
the coalition
and I think the Republican Party at this point only survives in its current form if it can maintain minority rule. So minority rule, the rule of a minority of white people over a kind of increasingly diverse majority, is now the explicit project of this party.
Yeah, and that's the debate, right? I mean, that's the sorting that Trump is doing. And if the people who oppose that, you said explicit project, if people within the Republican Party oppose that, are so sanctioned that they have to depart over it, right, that actually further polarizes it. Although I would point out whether you want to call those people objectors or whatever, they also exist. They were Republicans, at least at one point in time. I want to say two things. One, I'm going to be discussing this further with Jamil Smith, who joins us as part of our special coverage today. Second, I want to bring in California Congressman Ted Lieu. He serves on the Judiciary Committee, was one of the very first Democrats to actually back an impeachment probe, and he's now been joined by a majority of his caucus. And given that we're really talking about two pressures tonight, the departing pressure and the downward pressure on what is the Republican Party and Trump, and then the countervailing pressure that you now are backed by a majority of your colleagues. How do you look at that? Are you here saying what took them so long? Or are you saying finally? Are you saying this is going to move Speaker Pelosi, or you're not there yet?
So anyone who watched Special Counsel Mueller's testimony before Congress or read a Mueller report, there are three conclusions that are inescapable. First, that the Russians attacked us in a systematic and sweeping manner in 2016. Second, that the Trump campaign embraced that attack, gave them internal polling data, and planned their campaign strategy around the attack. And then third, that the president engaged in numerous acts of obstruction to stop the investigation into Russian interference. So what the American people and other members of Congress do with those facts, we'll know in the next few months. And Speaker Pelosi is going to make a decision with the Democratic caucus. She's an amazing leader. Whatever she decides, I will support.
Part of what you're saying is, what did the Mueller hearing do to move people who might not have known as much about it? And most of the reaction was from people, political, civic, media, whatever, who knew a lot about it. And so there was this kind of fixation on the performative aspect, on the fact that Mr. Mueller, who some of us have known and covered for a long time, he did look considerably older. He did not react to all the questions the way he had before. And I think for some people that was also just a shock and a reportable fact. And yet what you're saying is it may be that some of your colleagues actually have constituents who, despite all that, are closer to the underlying facts in the Mueller report, which do make the president look pretty bad. I report that as a fact. What to do about it is your job. Here was your colleague, fellow Democrat Castro, making the case at the debate. Take a look.
Folks are making a mistake by not pursuing impeachment. And what's going to happen in the fall of next year, of 2020, if they don't impeach him, is he's going to say, you see, the Democrats didn't go after me on impeachment. And you know why? Because I didn't do anything wrong. Conversely, if Mitch McConnell is the one that lets him off the hook, we're going to be able to say, well, sure, they impeached him in the House, Castro, but his friend Mitch McConnell, Moscow Mitch, let him off the hook.
Senator Bennett, please respond.
In your view, is that the best argument against this talking point that, well, if the Senate's not going to do anything, what's the point of this exercise?
So, Ari, you're absolutely correct about Special Counsel Mueller's testimony. He's not going to get an Emmy Award for what he did. But he did say yes and true and generally accurate to a truckload of very devastating facts about the president. And I think anyone watching it, that's substantively what they got. And we're, again, going to see what members of Congress, the American people, do with those facts. But those facts are incredibly damning.
Stay with me. I want to bring this to Eleanor. And Eleanor, I want to play a little bit from the speaker. And also, I want to do that awkward thing we do where I talk about a member of Congress who's also in the segment. But that's what we do when we welcome politicians to journalists. Congressman Lieu sounds, in his very respectful way, like he's not one of these people who's going to publicly put the heat on the speaker. You could disagree with that after I play this, but I wonder what the actual realities here are in your view as a longtime student of both Washington and the Democratic Party and its decision-making style, which sometimes seems a little different than the iron rule of some of the Republicans like McConnell, because Pelosi has been saying she's open and doing the meetings, but really continuously pushing this down the road to the point where the calendar could be her out. Take a look.
We will proceed when we have what we need to proceed, not one day sooner. And everybody has the liberty and the luxury to espouse their own position. I'm willing to take whatever heat there is. Eleanor?
That means she's not going to whip the vote, that it's a matter of conscience. She's not going to say we're going to all go for this or we're going to object. So I think she wants to be sure she has the caucus with her. I don't know if you meant to conflate the president's racist comments with impeachment. I think actually those are two separate things. I mean, what he says and is doing is despicable, but there's a long history of racial remarks made by presidents.
Well,
and Lyndon
I'll let you
Johnson,
continue.
I want to paraphrase. Lyndon Johnson said, you can take the most broken down white man, and if you give him somebody to look down on, you can pick his pocket and he won't even notice. Lyndon Johnson was a great civil rights president. So there are some realities here about the way race is being used that are not necessarily impeachable.
I'll go back to you, but I think the point is that the Democrats, whether you call it combine, link, or conflate, the Democrats have held their first impeachment vote since they came in office, led by Al Green, in response to what they deemed racist in that rebuke, which then is one avenue. The second avenue, they've said, is this potential obstruction-related impeachment. So I would argue, I think that's what they've been doing. But go ahead, Eleanor.
Right. And it failed when Al Green brought it up. So, yeah, I think Pelosi is a vote counter. And if impeachment goes to the floor, she will have the votes for it to pass. And whether it succeeds or not in the Senate may be a peripheral thought, because it could take a long time to wind its way through the House. And we've got all those Democrats who are going to be battling it out. So it could get to the Senate next year, which, that may be perfect timing, actually. Yeah. And Congressman, we're out of time, but this is not a presidential debate, but your name was referenced, so you can have a final word if you want.
Again, the facts are very damning about the president. Basically, we walked Special Counsel Mueller through obstruction of justice. There's 3 elements, at least 5 of the 10 instances laid out in his report. He indicated there's substantial evidence to all 3 elements. The best analogy I have is he gives you a slice of bread, he puts ham on it, puts another slice of bread on it, and says to us, well, what is it? And we go, that's a ham sandwich. And we ask him, do you agree? And he says, well, I didn't make a determination because the Department of Justice guidelines saying I can't call it that. But everyone knows it's a ham sandwich.
You know how easy it is to indict a ham sandwich.
Absolutely. That's exactly right.
Pelosi's waiting for the mustard.
Well, we have to find out who has the mustard. A Friday night question for everyone.
Right.
Really appreciate the reporting and analysis. Congressman Ted Lieu, Michelle Goldberg, Eleanor Clift. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.